The photograph now rests in a museum drawer. A Sherman tank crouched on a muddy Norman road, its sloping hull draped in sandbags and spare tracks like primitive armour. Across the glacis chalked words still faintly read, "Better safe than sorry." It was late June 1944, and the crew of this tank, 5 Americans barely past their 20s, were waiting for orders under low, colourless skies. In his pocket logbook, the gunner scribbled that day, paraphrased, "They say the bags make her heavy, sluggish, but heavy feels safer than light." That sentence captures the fragile hope of soldiers who knew their steel skin was never enough. The Sandbag Shermans, as they came to be known, were born from equal parts fear and improvisation, an attempt to cheat a battlefield that punished certainty. To understand that image, we must return to the uneasy months before it. In the spring of 1944, Allied planners prepared for Operation Overlord, the invasion that would carry an entire generation across the Channel and into occupied France. The Sherman, officially the M4 medium tank, was the workhorse of this armada, practical, mass-produced, and according to factory posters, ready for any terrain. By then, over 30,000 had rolled from American plants. Its virtues were reliability and speed. Its weakness lay in thin armour that had already betrayed crews in Africa and Italy. Reports from Tunisia had warned that German anti-tank guns could pierce its front plate at long range. Still, production priorities and logistical simplicity ruled over redesign. When the first divisions landed on the beaches of Normandy in early June, their Shermans carried standard armour, not yet the makeshift bulwark of sandbags that would soon define their silhouette. Private Jack Hollis, a loader from Kansas, had only glimpsed a tank once before enlisting. By 1943, he was training in England with the 3rd Armoured Division, learning to reload 80-pound shells in a space scarcely larger than a closet. He would later recall in a letter home, paraphrased, that the Sherman breathes hot and fast like a dog under a coat. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Samuel Rhine, a mechanical engineer by trade, shared both affection and distrust for their machine. They valued its manoeuvrability, yet knew its nickname among British crews, Ronson, after a cigarette lighter that lights every time. The label was cruel, but earned from desert battles in 1943, where Shermans burned easily when penetrated. Engineers debated fixes, soldiers devised their own. From their ranks would come the unsanctioned idea that a layer, any layer, between metal and enemy fire might turn chance into survival. The European campaign that June unfolded under contradictory omens. France was to be liberated, yet each kilometre inland deepened the test of Allied logistics. Normandy's hedgerows channeled movement into trap-like lanes. German Panzerfausts and Pak-40 guns waited behind every bend. In such close terrain, the Sherman's advantages, mechanical reliability, and numerical superiority meant little against a single hidden gunner. Within days of D-Day, field hospitals reported alarming patterns of burn injuries among tank crews. A July 1944 memo from the US Army's Ordnance Department estimated casualty rates among Sherman men at nearly 60% in the first week of the breakout. Some units lost entire platoons. Others watched replacements arrive faster than spare parts. Rumours circulated that German shells cut through like butter, and morale sank accordingly. In this climate of dread, imagination became a form of defence. Crews scavenged. At first they hung spare track links across the hull, meant simply to refill broken treads. They also added a few centimetres of steel. Then someone, accounts differ whether in the 2nd or 3rd Armoured Division, filled sandbags and stacked them over the glacis and sponsons, fastening with wire and hope. Word spread that the improvised padding might absorb fragments or detonate shaped charge warheads prematurely. By the time official channels took notice, hundreds of Shermans bore these ungainly mantles. Photographs from July 1944 show American convoys trundling through Carrington, with hulls bulging like overloaded wagons. Commanders frowned at the aesthetic, but hesitated to forbid what seemed to steady nerves. Historians still debate who first authorised, or at least tolerated, the modification. Some credit Colonel Charles Bromley of the 2nd Armoured Division, who acknowledged in a field note that the men will not be talked out of their armour. Others believe improvisations appeared simultaneously across several units, born from shared anxiety rather than order. Either way, sandbagging became folk engineering, a ritual of self-assurance. Crews scoured nearby farms for burlap sacks, shoveling soil or sand until the bags weighed 20 to 30 kilograms each. They arranged them 3 deep on the front hull and turret bustle, sometimes layering with concrete or welding extra track pieces atop the soft shield. Within a week, a tank's weight could climb by a ton or more, a costly liability in mud, but no man wanted to be the first to strip them off. One might ask why rational armies permitted such a crude alteration. The answer lies partly in psychology. Warfare on mechanized fields often breaks into superstition. The machine that carries protection also embodies vulnerability. The sandbags represented agency in an environment ruled by randomness. They could be touched, lifted, adjusted, a physical barrier against unseen fire. Rhine, ever the engineer, tried to compute their value but confessed in an August note, "Until someone is hit and lives, the math remains faith." That line would gain tragic weight within weeks. Technically, the logic was shaky. Sand might block fragments from artillery high-explosive shells, but against serious anti-tank rounds or shaped charge weapons, its benefits were dubious. German engineers from captured units later told interrogators that sand dampened blast spread a little, not enough to matter. Yet anecdotes accumulated of tanks surviving near misses that once meant annihilation. Official US tests conducted in December 1944 would conclude that at best, sandbags offered minimal protection against armour-piercing shells and caused mechanical wear. But by then the practice had transcended practicality. It had become ritual comfort, much like the St. Christopher medals tucked behind gauges or names painted on turrets. Beyond the technical debate, these improvised defences reflected the evolving relationship between soldier and machine. As the war shifted from sweeping offensives to grinding attrition, crews began to personalise their armour with nicknames, graffiti and adornments that blurred the line between humanity and steel. The sandbag layer turned the Sherman's industrial uniformity into individual expression. Walking through a bivouac near St. Lo in late July 1944, one correspondent observed rows of tanks girded like camels, each pile arranged differently, reminders that beneath standardised designs lay deeply personal fears. Even generals recognised the morale effect. An Army Service Forces circular that August cautiously endorsed experiments within reason so long as performance is not impaired, tacitly admitting that reassurance possessed tactical value. Life within these armoured shelters remained harsh. Drivers fought reduced visibility, engines overheated under the added mass. Mud seized the wheels more easily, forcing mechanics to shovel off layers before every long march. Still, most crews refused to remove them. Hollis later told an interviewer in 1947 that a tank looks naked without the bags, a sentiment echoing from Normandy to the Ardennes. During halts, men patched torn sacks, refilled them, even joked that they were feeding the tank. The relationship was intimate and absurd, reflecting how prolonged exposure to mortal danger reshapes one's sense of rationality. The European countryside added its own symbolism. The sandbags, drawn from earth, returned to shield the men who flattened other fields. French villagers watching convoys pass sometimes waved or offered fresh sacks. In Allied newsreels, the bulky Shermans appeared oddly gentle, grimy, burdened, but somehow humanized by their improvised armour. They contrasted sharply with sleek German Panthers and Tigers, whose machine perfection evoked fear rather than kinship. It may be no accident that even after official disapproval, the sight of bagged tanks persisted. Crews clung to whatever made survival feel participatory, not passive. In letters home, some soldiers framed the habit as a metaphor for resilience. One sergeant in the 4th Armoured Division wrote his wife, paraphrased, "Every man finds his own armour, honey. Some it's a prayer card, some a sack of dirt." That humility distinguished the grassroots nature of the practice from any institutional doctrine. Officials could debate ballistic coefficients. The crews measured belief by who came back. Still, within high command, frustration grew. By the time Allied forces pushed into Belgium during the autumn rains, mechanical breakdowns multiplied. Tank depots reported slow suspension failures attributed to overloading. A few officers pointed out bitterly that faith weighs tons. Yet each mechanic sent to strip the extras faced arguments from crews who had already attributed their lives to them. This friction between regulation and human instinct, a theme as old as war itself, would continue shaping the Sherman story until the very end. As of September 1944, Official reports finally weighed in. Tests at Isigny concluded that sandbags and spare track links might protect against small-caliber shrapnel, but were ineffective against direct hits from German 75 mm or 88 mm guns. The armour department recommended factory applique plates instead, rigid steel welded to the sides, but those could not reach the field soon enough, and so the veterans kept piling their makeshift bulwark. Many historians later suggested that the sandbag craze offered insight into wartime innovation. Tiny experiments scattered across chaos, some futile, some prophetic, all intensely human. In the personal chronicle of Lieutenant Rhine, recovered decades afterward, one line stands apart. We armoured our fears with earth as if weight could buy us time. That quiet observation bridges the technical and emotional truths of the episode. What began as a practical measure ended as collective confession, proof that even mechanised war depends as much on psychology as metallurgy. By the dawn of winter, the bagged Shermans had become almost emblematic of the front itself, mud-laden, weary, improvised, resilient. In the Ardennes, where frost stiffened both man and machine, their crude armour would soon face the great test of the Battle of the Bulge. As columns formed under frozen trees, crews checked engines, tightened periscopes, and adjusted the sagging rows of sandbags one last time. Some believed the weight would save them, others simply needed to believe something would. And so the story moves forward, from invention born of fear to the battlefield where faith and physics would contend for supremacy. The improvised armour of hope was ready to meet the fire that would prove or disprove its worth. By mid-December 1944, snow had transformed the Ardennes into a muffled labyrinth of mist and spruce. What Allied soldiers first thought a lull became, on 16th of December, the sudden thunder of German counterattack, the opening of the Battle of the Bulge. In this frozen forest, Lieutenant Samuel Reiner's platoon from the 3rd Armoured Division took position near St. Vith, their Shermans burdened by the same sandbag armour that now hung stiff as stone. The engines struggled against cold oil, radios crackled, fragments of orders drowned in static. Private Jack Hollis, his gloves stiff with frost, wrote briefly in a pencil-smudged booklet, paraphrased, "It's so cold the tank feels carved from the hill. We're waiting to see if all those sacks mean anything." The answer came in flashes and echoes. German panzer divisions, strengthened by Panthers and the dreaded Tiger II, struck through narrow valleys where Allied armour could scarcely manoeuvre. Fire met fire in distances often under 300 metres, point-blank ranges where the sandbagged Shermans learned the limits of faith. Hits that once peeled plates now sent geysers of dirt and dust. Some rounds ricocheted, others bored through with terrible finality. Observers noted that the makeshift defences sometimes blunted high explosive shells striking at oblique angles, saving crews from fragments. But against shaped charges from handheld Panzerfausts, the weapon most feared in the forests, they offered only false mercy. When a cumulative jet of molten copper met damp sand, it burrowed as if the bags were air. Still, every narrow escape reinforced belief. Survivor reports from Company E mentioned a tank absorbing shrapnel thanks to its sand mantle. The same crew patched the gaps by nightfall, adding fresh sacks. As the offensive thickened, terrain and weather joined battle as equal adversaries. Heavy snowfall obscured periscopes, and weighty armour strained clutches on uphill tracks. Reiner counselled his men to shed extra baggage, but few obeyed. He later recalled, paraphrased, "I asked them to trust mechanics, but they trusted the dirt. They were tired of invisible enemies." The invisible enemy was not only the German gunners hidden behind ridges, it was the doubt freezing inside each man, the arithmetic of chance replacing any notion of invulnerability. The 4th Armoured Division's orders to relieve Bastogne on 26 December pushed Reiner's unit southward. Convoys groaned through rutted roads, their once smooth hulls now veiled in ice. Civilians, Belgian farmers and refugees dragging sleds, watched the armoured columns crawl past, wondering how these burdened machines could liberate anyone. Local accounts record children pressed against fences, touching the sandbags as they passed, thinking them mail sacks or supplies. For many towns, a tank meant both safety and destruction. Its arrival repelled occupation, but often raised homes in the process. After one shell exchange near Houffalize, Hollis saw an abandoned farmhouse collapse after catching the blast of his own gun's backwash. "It's hard to tell where saving begins and breaks off," he wrote soon after. By January 1945, the German thrust had lost momentum. The Shermans, scarred and heavier than ever, resumed the long advance toward the Rhine. In liberated villages, command photographers began capturing images intended for morale reports. One of these photographs shows Rhine's tank, its front caved in but crew alive, a string of peeling sandbags still lashed to the glacis. The caption reads, "Improvised armour, it worked this time." That "this time" said everything about probability as law. For each tank saved, another burned, sometimes because the fared in cover trapped extra fuel cans or ladders of spare track that exploded in flame. An ordnance test detail visiting the division in February warned crews that added weight increased the risk of bogging down an undercut turret traverse. Such memoranda rarely reached the front in time. Even if they had, faith dies late into war. Meanwhile, the technology of the Sherman itself was shifting under pressure. Newer models mounting the 76mm gun, or fitted with welded applique plates from factories in Detroit, began to replace the field-modified veterans. Mechanics in Antwerp ports stripped sandbags from worn hulls before rail shipment, calling them war souvenirs. Some crews pleaded to keep them. Others, like Reiner's, saw it as relief to shed old fears. He commented to a war correspondent in March 1945, paraphrased, "The first shell that hits a clean tank feels colder, but lighter too." That moment of honesty highlighted the thin line between mechanical adaptation and psychological armour. Soldiers had learned to read weight as reassurance. Though the European front was moving east, logistics still wrestled with mud and fuel shortages. April rains turned Germany's farm roads into grey bogs. Hollis noted in one of his final letters that his tank carries enough dirt on her to return to Kansas twice. The words are half jest, half exhaustion. When the unit reached the Ruhr pocket, scattered resistance turned every barn into a possible ambush. Time and space compressed. Officers ordered reduced loads to keep pace with rapidly advancing infantry. Crews threw off sections of their sand cover reluctantly, stacking them by the roadside like burial mounds for habits. If Normandy had been a crucible of invention, and the Ardennes its grim test, the closing months in Germany were an epilogue written by survival instinct. Villagers watched these machines roll through their ruined streets, familiar shapes under foreign markings. Some wept, some merely stared. For them, it was the same sight as in 1940, only reversed. Within Allied ranks, the practice of sandbagging declined not through direct prohibition, but through exhaustion. The war had changed pace, and men had grown past the need to negotiate with fate. Yet traces remained. Even freshly issued Shermans bore scratches where previous crews had mounted rails for the makeshift armour, scars of human improvisation welded into steel. The phenomenon also spread quietly into other armies by imitation. British units experimented with concrete layers. Soviet tankers, hearing of American sand shields, sometimes piled logs or welded thin plating to side skirts. Each army dreamed its shortcut to invulnerability. War newspaper broadcasts repeated sensational stories of a single Sherman surviving 3 direct hits thanks to its burden of sand. Radio AFN's evening slot in late March paraphrased a field report. "Yank ingenuity saves lives again. Don't laugh at those extra pounds of hope." The propaganda tone masked uncertainty, but offered the home front an image of creative courage. Through all this, Reiner's and Hollis's stories intertwined with hundreds of unnamed crews. The loader from Kansas had become a veteran gunner by combat's end, his hands permanently burned from cordite residue. In a letter dated 20th April 1945, weeks before Germany's surrender, he reflected that every idea out here begins as rumour. Some rumours stop bullets. That sentence, preserved in an army post office envelope, distills the spirit of a generation that learned to trust rumour over regulation. Neither science nor superstition alone kept men alive. The intersection between them did. For civilians scattered along the war's path, the sight of sandbagged Shermans became a shorthand for liberation, an emblem of weary persistence. In Cologne, April 1945, newsreels filmed Allied armour crossing the Rhine under flak bursts, sacks still dangling from fenders. To an uninformed viewer, they might have seemed deliberate design features. Few knew that each hung sack had been adjusted by human hands against rain, mud, and tremor, repeated until muscle memory replaced fear. The war was turning resolutely mechanical. yet its shape was still carved by emotion. As victory neared, engineering branches issued orders for systematic evaluation of all field modifications. At Aberdeen Proving Ground later that summer, researchers fired captured shells into reconstructed sandbag walls mounted on test hulls. The conclusion: negligible benefit against armour-piercing ammunition, slight cushioning against high explosive fragments. Numbers spoke decisively. Physics reduced faith to charted failure rates. But among veterans reading the bulletins, the outcome meant little. They remembered the handful who survived because the first burst shattered on compressed sand instead of steel. Survival, after all, is always anecdotal. By May 1945, when Europe officially fell quiet, Rhine's tank sat outside a disused mill on the Weser River. The sandbags had split under months of rain, tall grasses poking through the seams. Mechanics slated the vehicle for return to depot. Its crew was reassigned to transport duties. Before departure, Rhine carved into the mudguard with a knife. From earth we came, to earth we owe delay. It was less an epitaph than a private equation. Acknowledgement that the armour of dirt had bought them nothing more or less than time. If the battlefront dissolved into occupation, the habit persisted wherever men feared the next war. Early Korean War photographs capture US. Shermans once again laced with sandbags, echoing the lessons or myths of 1944. Officers cited previous experience, crews cited intuition. Technology had advanced. Jet aircraft, shaped charge warheads, heavier armour, but superstition endures beyond innovation. From Rhine's generation to theirs stretched a slender thread of reasoning. Maybe a human hand, by altering the machine, could still bargain with destruction. When Hollis returned home in 1946, he kept one frayed burlap scrap that had shielded the front of his tank. Years later, he would show it to students as a kind of relic, saying, "It didn't stop a shell, but maybe it stopped us from freezing." Such recollections hint at the emotional dimension long invisible in technical histories. The sandbag saga was never solely about ballistics. It was about men reaching to reassert control over something colossal and abstract, the idea of fate under mechanized war. Toward the campaign's end, Allied units advancing into Bavaria crossed bridges draped with banners reading "Victory by Design." The Shermans crossing those spans still showed marks of improvised armour hastily stripped or collapsed, tapestries of mud and wire. Rhine watched one column from his jeep, noting later in a post-war debrief, paraphrased, "They looked naked but free, like they remembered they were machines again." After years of burden, shedding those layers was not simply mechanical. It was spiritual relief. Behind them lay forests of broken hopes and salvaged myths, behind every farm mound where soldiers had once filled sacks while listening to distant guns. The practice of sandbagging disappeared as quietly as it had begun, leaving only grainy photographs and survivor tales. For historians, it would become a parenthesis in the evolution of armoured warfare, a symbol of ingenuity misapplied, or courage misunderstood. For those who lived it, its meaning was simpler. When physics could not comfort, the earth itself would serve. In the still winter of 1945, as bent tracks cooled beside abandoned sacks, the line between science and superstition dissolved into memory. Those who survived the forests would carry the habit in story if not in practice. And from that story arises the enduring question not of whether sand saved steel, but how belief shaped survival, how men armoured not only their tanks but their minds while awaiting the final gun to fall silent. The thaw would soon expose the rusting hulks across Europe's fields, signs of a war that had outgrown its makeshift faith and now awaited history's judgment, where numbers and memories would conflict without ever fully cancelling one another. It was there, amid that uneasy quiet, that the meaning of the sandbag armour began to change, from tool to testimony, from protection to proof of the human urge to defy inevitability, and there, the story turns toward its end and reckoning. When the gunfire finally ebbed and the fields of Western Europe fell silent, the sand-laden Shermans stood among the ruins like exhausted beasts of burden. By official estimates, the US Army deployed over 49,000 M4 tanks of various models during the European and Pacific campaigns. Of these, roughly 1 in 5 was lost to enemy fire, mechanical failure, or accident. Exact numbers remain debated. Some researchers suggest up to 10,000 M4s destroyed in Europe alone, but consensus holds that tens of thousands of crewmen were killed or wounded within them. These losses were not distributed evenly. The armoured divisions that led assaults through Normandy, the Ardennes and across the Rhine absorbed the steepest toll. Few post-war reviews mentioned sandbags specifically, though Army engineers quietly noted that additional mass contributed to fatigue failures exceeding 5% of late war losses. Such figures, like the cracked measurement dial salvaged from wrecks, translate human belief into cold arithmetic. By the summer of 1945, depots from Antwerp to Bremen overflowed with derelict armour. Mechanics cut away dangling sacks, replacing them with fresh paint for display parades. In the vast culling that followed, scarcely anyone bothered to record which hulls had once carried their improvised burden. The surviving crews dispersed into transport regiments or homebound ships, their machines left behind as skeletons of ingenuity and fear. For the local populations clearing rubble, these tanks were merely another layer of scrap to melt into reconstruction steel. Yet in conversations with villagers years later, historians sometimes heard flickers of memory. "Those tanks came with the earth on them," a farmer near Bastogne recalled, "and it looked like they were carrying their own graves." That sentence may not be verifiable, but its emotional truth lingers more vividly than inventories. The military verdict came quickly. By 1946, the US Army's armour branch classified field sandbagging as ineffective and potentially dangerous, urging standardised steel applique kits instead. The British and Canadians reached similar conclusions after their own trials. Tactically, the war had demonstrated that mass production and numerical advantage outweighed attempts at individual customisation. The lesson seemed clear: engineering should emerge from laboratories, not trenches. Yet for those who'd lived the contradiction, the real education was subtler. On paper, sand offered no protection. In memory, it represented control when none existed. That dissonance, between measurable fact and psychological necessity, became one of the quietest yet deepest insights to come out of the armoured war. Ethically, the story revealed how the conditions of industrial combat could erode the boundary between reason and faith. At the front, every technical rule was filtered through emotion. The same men who trusted scientific machinery also turned instinctively to ritual, lining their periscopes with lucky coins, pasting photographs beside gunnery charts. The sandbag practice lay exactly at that intersection, a tangible declaration that survival demanded participation, not just obedience. From this standpoint, historians sometimes interpret the phenomenon not as mechanical superstition, but as a democratic impulse within the machine age. Proof that individual will could still alter the standardized instruments of war, even if the alteration itself was futile. Politically and culturally, the improvisations of Allied tankers became part of a larger narrative about wartime ingenuity. Post-war documentaries and magazines celebrated them as examples of field creativity, expressions of the same spirit that had built the broader arsenal of democracy. These retellings seldom mentioned that many ideas failed, costing extra fuel, time, or lives. Yet they helped to forge a mythology of adaptation, useful in the anxious decades of the Cold War when armies needed stories of human flexibility against technological threat. Thus, an act once driven by desperation was recast as emblem of modern resourcefulness. The truth, as always, balances between valour and necessity. The sandbags neither transformed the Sherman into invincible armour, nor reduced the men inside to mere cogs. They testified to the uneasy coexistence of both images. For Rhine and Hollis, that coexistence carried into peace. Rhine left the service in 1946 and returned to engineering, quietly advising design teams on new armour distribution for the coming generation of tanks. When asked during an oral history interview in the 1960s whether the sandbags worked, he paused before answering, paraphrased by the archivist, "They worked at keeping us sane." Hollis, the Kansas gunner, gave more concrete evidence of memory's endurance. He donated his torn burlap scrap to a local museum, labelling it "dust from a borrowed hope." These gestures, part confession and part offering, showed how technical debate had become personal theology. Neither man sought vindication. Both treated the episode as a shared parable about human invention under pressure. From an analytical perspective, the saga generated multiple lessons beyond the battleground. Strategically, it highlighted the gap between frontline experience and command-level understanding. Rapid innovation can arise from the field precisely because no procedure forbids desperation. Morally, it illuminated the way soldiers translate vulnerability into labour, turning fear into action, even if the product of that action barely matters. Politically, it questioned how institutions remember improvisation. Do they record it as error to prevent recurrence, or as inspiration to invoke courage? Each answer reveals more about the society that asks than the war that inspired the question. The broader impact, though less visible, extended into civilian thought. The same tension between improvisation and doctrine shaped post-war design philosophies, how engineers approached risk, how industries balanced human flexibility with mechanical precision. Even today, the story reappears in design schools as a case study in field adaptation. Its enduring relevance owes less to tactics than to temperament. In any high-stakes system, from laboratories to disaster zones, there will always be that moment when regulation pauses and intuition speaks, the moment when a worker, scientist, or soldier adds their own sandbag to the institution's armour. Across nations, the relics of that belief still linger in open-air museums, faded Shermans with a few original sacks glued by dust beneath their hulls, preserved more for sentiment than science. Visitors run their hands over the rough texture, imagining fingers 50 years gone tightening those cords in rain and smoke. Each bag's weight has changed from defence to remembrance. The earth that once promised safety now serves to anchor memory. As one veteran told a journalist during a Normandy reunion, paraphrased, "We trusted the dirt because it belonged to everyone." His remark may contain the quiet philosophy that underlies the entire war, that fragile solidarity, grounded quite literally in the soil, can outlast the inventions built to protect it. Measured purely by outcomes, the dumb sandbag hack never altered the course of the conflict. Measured by what it revealed of those who fought it, the idea becomes profound, that the desire to survive will always seek tactile expression, even against empirical reason. Military historians catalogue battles by divisions and tonnage, yet in each ledger hides the trace of someone bending rules to feel less powerless. From their hesitant hands came hybrid machines that momentarily blurred the line between tool and shelter, regulation and faith. In those brief improvisations lies a testament to the human capacity to cling, to adapt, and to attribute meaning to the smallest barrier against chaos. Outside modern tank monuments, grass grows unimpeded through what once were tracks. Rain darkens the steel, dumping the same soil that men once hoisted to save themselves. Looking at those quiet forms, one might hear an echo of Reiner's field note. We armoured our fears with earth, as if weight could buy us time. That echo belongs not merely to a single generation, but to all who face calamity armed with ingenuity and uncertainty. And perhaps the real question lingering behind the final patrols is not whether the sandbags stopped a shell, but what inner distance their weight measured, the space between logic and hope, between a man and his belief that even the ground beneath him might still come to his rescue.